Today we're reviewing the Fractal Torrent Compact. This is the smaller version of the Fractal Torrent that we reviewed previously. We also have the Fractal Torrent Nano, that's for mini ITX. We're not reviewing it today. But now there are smaller options for the Torrent, which we reviewed very positively previously. It was probably the highest scoring case we reviewed last year or even in the last couple of years. So the Torrent got high praise, but this one, it's still two 180mm fans. It's priced in the $150 to $170 range depending on the option you buy. And today we're going to be reviewing it in depth. There's one major aspect of it that we really dislike, but the rest of it is pretty interesting. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now, and we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So right up front, the differences between the versions. The $150 versions of this case are just without RGB fans. That's basically the difference. And $170, you get the one we have, which has the RGB LED fans. Technically, the fans have very slightly different specs in their CFM and their pressure specifications, but they're basically the same. So they'll test about the same regardless of which one you have. So then, the cheaper one lines it up with a lot of very competitive cases on the market. Things like the Cooler Master TD500, the H500P Mesh, the H500 Blank, all from Cooler Master. Fractal's previous lineup, like the Meshify 2 series, including its own compact. The Phanteks P400A and the later P500A. Corsair's 4000D Airflow, 5000D Airflow. There's a lot of really good cases that are both cheaper than this and around the same price as this. So this is a fierce market to compete in for any case. This is functionally a shrunken version of the larger Torrent. The panels come off just as easily. They have roughly the same design as the original one. It's got the same fan sizes up front. It only has 2 fans stock, and you should probably keep those if you buy it because that's where most of the money is going, is into these fans. So swapping them out just doesn't make sense. You should just buy a different case if that's what you're going to do. It does make the radiator sizing a little difficult if you're doing radiators, but otherwise, really interesting case, especially for something with a tower cooler, and double especially, because with these shorter cases, the really cool thing with them is that it pushes the intake as close as possible to the components getting cooled. So you have a lot more velocity as the air hits those fin stacks, and it also keeps the air in its sort of room ambient state rather than warming it up too much before it hits stuff. So generally, these smaller, more compact designs we see are beneficial thermally rather than the opposite. So we gave the Torrent previously our best case overall and best airflow, but it also stood out for being a stark contrast from Fractal's standard, overly safe design choices of the past. We'll try to avoid repeating ourselves in this review, so that means we're going to limit some of the discussion of basic design choices, and you'll have to go watch the original Torrent review to get those, just so it's not too redundant. The one thing we do want to bring back up, the only major issue with the original Torrent was the riser cable, which was a potential fire hazard. However, Fractal did the right thing and got out way ahead of it, as in basically immediately when it launched. It recalled all of the cases it had shipped to retailers and distributors, and it also offered a recall for customers where they could send it back in, they could get the cable replaced with one that we tested independently and found was a much higher quality cable anyway, and also from what we saw, did not have that same electrical short issue. So that was the one thing that Fractal, potentially they could have really botched that launch. The case would be dead to everyone at this point. It would be very unfortunate because it's a good case, but that's a massive oversight. Huge issue. Fractal dealt with it well. All of these manufacturers will make a mistake at some point. There's so many moving parts in the chain. A lot of them are third parties, so someone's going to screw up at some point for everyone. But dealing with it is what matters. Fractal dealt with it well. So this one comes with the same fan hub we cleared previously from the updated version. All right, let's get started with the build notes and talk about how the case is structured and designed. We'll go through the thermals and all of that and talk about the one major aspect we don't like. So enter the compact at this point. One point we raised with the original Torrent was that there was no option to install 3.5-inch drives inside the top chamber of the case. The smaller Torrent Compact rectifies this with an optional 3.5-inch bay that can be mounted directly adjacent to the power supply. This tray won't fit if the power supply has a significant amount of cable clutter, especially non-modular ones, but it's a welcomed addition, and it also wasn't just slapped on as an afterthought. The tray can be positioned in 2 locations. One of them gives access to the fill port at the front of the case, and the other one gives more space to the power supply. If you need both, you may need to add or remove this drive as you get through the filling process. There are no other 3.5-inch mounting locations in this case. There certainly isn't space for hard drives behind the motherboard tray, but Fractal did manage to cram in 3 2.5-inch drive mounts. The worst shortcoming of the Torrent Compact is cable management. We already had some difficulty with the full-sized Torrent in this regard, but as we showed in our review, we were able to solve most of the problems by simply pulling the slack cable up into the power supply chamber. In the Torrent Compact, there's, at best, 2 centimeters of clearance for cables behind the side panel, and that's not accounting for the optional plastic cable channels, the shallower section towards the front of the case, or any of the other accessories that eat up space. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't get the Compact's side panel to shut without screwing it down. And even then, the glass is prone to warping out at one corner. The width of the case has been scaled down proportionally with height and depth versus the Torrent, but because the interior of the case must be at least 180 millimeters wide to fit the front intake fans, a disproportionate amount of that space was subtracted from the cable space behind the board. On the positive side, that means that clearance inside the body of the case for CPU air coolers is still nearly as good as it was in the full-size Torrent, at 174 millimeters versus 188. That'll fit most of the good CPU air coolers we've reviewed recently in our CPU cooler reviews. GPU clearance is down from the Torrent's 423 to 330 with the front fans installed for that. As with the original, the expansion slots are bridgeless and they can be swapped for a vertical GPU mounting kit. Now, general disclaimer here, vertical GPUs, if they're too close to the glass and they're air-cooled, the result will be abysmal for thermals of the GPU, so don't mount it vertically if it's going to push the front of the card within an inch or so of the glass. If you're doing water cooling, though, it doesn't matter. Moving past the space problem, the cable guides and tie points are otherwise effective. There's a mysterious metal cable management bracket, as Fractal calls it, right above the fan hub, and our best guess is that it's meant for wrapping thin RGB and fan cables around like a cleat on a dock, although maybe that's language we should reserve for a Corsair review. More sales. The top-mounted PSU location may necessitate some cable extension, since these days, power supply cable lengths are determined with bottom mounting in mind. We routed our GPU power cables from above the card for this reason, rather than below as we usually would. The big draw of the Torrent and the Torrent series is clearly the 180mm fans. Our sample is the Torrent Compact RGB Black TG Lite, which comes with 2 of Fractal's Prisma AL18 PWM ARGB fans. These fans, like the ones on the original Torrent, are thick. These ones are 38mm thick, and as Fractal states in the reviewer guide, they, quote, leverage power, size, and thickness for greatly enhanced air-moving capacity. Great. That phrasing will definitely win the hearts and minds of memers everywhere. For sure, that is going to be one of the most quoted aspects of this case. These fans can be moved to the bottom of the case just as they could in the original Torrent, but doing so prevents the use of ATX motherboards or the lower front 180mm fan mount. When reinstalling the 180s, be aware that they're thick enough that they block their own cable cutouts, so you'll need to route the fan cables before screwing the fans down. Additionally, there's no built-in RGB controller for the fans or the LEDs on the power supply shroud, so without power from a motherboard or third-party controller, all LEDs will remain dark. If the 180mm fans are relocated or removed, 2 fan rails can be installed to adapt the front mounts to 120mm or 140mm spacing. These work the same way as they did in the original. We liked them then, and we still like them now. As far as radiators, the maximum claimed radiator compatibility from Fractal's marketing is 280mm for the bottom, 120mm for the rear position, or 360mm up to 403mm for the front in total. Now that 403 number is a little bit funny. That one assumes that the fans are mounted to the front panel in a push or a push-pull configuration. There isn't enough space under the I/O assembly to mount a 360mm radiator directly to the chassis. Realistically speaking, there's just not enough space, period. So you should just use a smaller radiator. The front and the bottom mounts conflict where they meet, so plan conservatively for multi-radiator configurations, and installing any fans or radiators in the bottom of the case will obstruct access to the bottom of an ATX board. So it's tricky to work with for open loop, but that's expected for a smaller case. You need to do some planning before you buy everything, and end up with parts that don't fit well. The feet of the Compact are skeletonized to allow greater airflow, which is a good idea for a case that encourages bottom mounting fans. The full-sized Torrent actually has the same feature, but we didn't single it out last time. The case feet can be removed for, quote, ease of fan installation, but if we get our marketing translator in, what Fractal actually means here is that part of the bottom fan mounts are not accessible at all without removing the feet. So it's not just for ease of installation, it's a requirement. The smaller Compact doesn't have the removable bottom fan tray that the larger original did, and that's what circumvented this problem originally. The top panel can still be screwed into place, but it doesn't come with the captive thumb screws of the full-size version. We recommend installing the screws, having the top slide off every time you rest your hand on the top and plug something into the back of the PC gets old fast, and it'll just prevent mistakes if you ever pick it up to move it. The fan hub installed in our Torrent Compact is a Nexus 9P Slim V1.1, no affiliation in the Nexus naming there. Both the front and the back planes of the PCB are grounded, which we verified by scratching through the protective coating. All of the through holes are plated, but they're also intentionally isolated and not connected to ground. This is the fan hub that Fractal designed and shipped as a replacement after the early Torrent units short-circuited. We covered this design in detail, including PCB schematics sent to us by Fractal back in September. More than perhaps any other case, the Torrent Compact is built to be used in its stock configuration. It comes with 2 intake fans, and as we learned from the marketing, they are thick and big. So they should be plenty. There's little reason to alter the placement of the stock 180mm fans other than the Radiator installation, and the Torrent family's design leans toward air cooling anyway. We experimented with moving the fans around to the bottom of the case instead in our original review of the larger one, but we found it best to just leave them in place. Our main goal with these new thermal tests is to see whether the Compact performs any better or worse than the original, but also to see how it does in a more constricted space. Our sample is the RGB review sample. It should be close in performance to the non-RGB Torrent Compact variants, although Fractal claims technically a slightly lower CFM rating for the ARGB fans, as opposed to the non-RGB ones, at 146.8 versus 153.7 CFM. There's also a static pressure change where the non-RGB ones are 2.5 millimeters H2O versus 2.26. So the rest of it, the RPM and the power specs, those are the same. We'll be prepared to verify those claims soon on the fan tester. In CPU torture testing, just showing the Fractal cases first, the Compact averaged 41 degrees Celsius on the CPU under full system torture workload. That's within variance of the larger Torrent, and therefore at the very top of the Fractal results. The internal layout of the smaller case is almost exactly the same, and the powerful front-to-back airflow that it creates is ideal for tower coolers, even without a rear exhaust fan. In many cases, the power supply shroud would block off a section of the front intake fans. In the Torrent and the Torrent Compact, however, the half shroud keeps the front fans unobstructed and may even help guide air toward the CPU cooler. Comparatively now, Lian Li's 011 Air Mini and Fractal's own Meshify 2 Compact compete for the same audience as the Torrent Compact in that they're small mid-towers and a focus is on airflow here. But both are less expensive. They're $110 MSRP each. Technically, they're selling for more than that on some retailers, but it's $150 for the non-RGB Torrent Compact, so pretty big price difference. Both of the other cases here performed well in this test, at 44 degrees average for the Air Mini and 47 for the Meshify 2 Compact, and both cases performed better out of the box than earlier variants thanks to additional stock fans. However, neither matched the Torrent Compact with the dual 180mm intake, so the Torrent Compact is living up to the larger case's performance. GPU temperature in the same torture test averaged 51 degrees, slightly higher than the big Torrent's 50 degree average, so within variance really here. Fractal has done a good job though of keeping the case floor breathable and lifted above the table surface, which helps keep GPU thermals under control even when fans aren't mounted in the bottom slots. Removing the front panel didn't meaningfully change the temperature. We technically saw an increase, which may be an indication of the positive pressure system shifting its bias towards the CPU cooler instead. That said, it's within error, so it could just be test variance, it could be an actual pressure system change, but there's nothing worth thinking further about. Comparatively, this isn't the case's strongest point. It still performs well overall. It's at 51 degrees, which is just between the Cooler Master TD500 mesh and the Corsair 4000D airflow. And both of those were well received in our testing. Like Lian Li with the Mini 011s, Fractal has scaled down the case legs with the smaller version of the case, but it didn't go overboard. The case floor is now 4 centimeters above the table surface rather than 4.5 centimeters. Neither the Meshify 2 Compact nor the Air Mini performed exceptionally in this area, with the Air Mini in particular demonstrating our point about case legs. It was a 59-degree average. The Torrent Compact may be more expensive, but its stock fans add definite value. So if you were going to buy fans and put them in a cheaper case, it's worth thinking about this one just because you'll keep the fans with this one. Rendering our GN Monkey Head test scene on the CPU resulted in an average of 34 degrees, definitely warmer than the larger Torrent's 32-degree average, but still unmatched by any other of the cases on our chart. And this, as a reminder, is a CPU-only workload here, so it's much lighter than some of the earlier ones. The LAN-Cool 2 Mesh comes close, but our primary comparison points, the O11 Air Mini and the Meshify 2 Compact, averaged 37 degrees and 36 degrees respectively. Moving the same test to GPU rendering resulted in a GPU average of 24 degrees. Again, warmer than the Torrent's 21-degree average, but still in its proper place among mesh-fronted cases like the 4000D Airflow and the Montech X3. These lower intensity tests don't allow the Compact to differentiate itself quite as much, but much like the GPU torture test, the Air Mini and the Meshify 2 Compact also fell behind in this test, with averages of 27 degrees and 25 degrees, keeping the Torrent Compact ahead. This test is similar to a gaming workload. This is for Firestrike. The average GPU temperature during Firestrike Extreme Stress testing was 50 degrees, close to the torture test results, and again warmer than the original Torrent, which landed at 47 degrees here. Although the layout of the case is the same as the originals, the reduced case length means that the Compact places its intake fans closer to the end of the GPU, which has a positive effect on internal airflow. Our test system's GPU now sits less than 5 centimeters away from the closest front intake fan, so it's very close, and these results don't really change the stack with our comparison cases, both of which did poorly relative to the Torrent Compact. The Meshify 2 Compact managed 57 degrees, but the O11 Air Mini ended up at the hottest edge of the chart. The main takeaway here, though, for the Torrent Compact is that CPU thermals remain low even under this gaming workload. You shouldn't change the fans in this case, and certainly not to smaller ones. Still, we're doing that for our standardized fan testing. This test has a lot of shortcomings, but it's also very useful in some ways. It's always requested by the audience, and you should check our methodology piece to better understand the ways it's good and the ways that it's not useful. Swapping to our standardized set of one 120mm exhaust and two 140mm intake fans had no significant effect on CPU temperature, with a duplicated average of 41 degrees. The larger Torrent CPU thermals suffered with this same set of fans with an average of 44 degrees, so the Compact is at the top of this particular chart. The Air Mini and the Meshify 2 Compact tied at 47 degrees. Our standard fan configuration is close to stock for both of these cases, so that's why there's a lack of improvement there. GPU thermals were also unchanged, remaining at 51 degrees average. Again, the original Torrent performed worse with this set of fans and averaged 55 degrees, allowing the Compact to pull ahead. The smaller case can be more effectively cooled by the smaller fans, but that information is of limited use, since most people buying Torrents will use the large stock fans. We measured the noise level of the Compact with its two front fans at 100% speed to be 47.8 dBA at our standardized measuring distance and methodology. That's quieter than the original Torrent's 50.8 dBA reading, and therefore requiring less of a speed reduction to hit our target of 36 dBA for the threshold. We reduced the fans to 50% speed rather than the 47% used for the original Torrent. Average CPU temperature in that test climbed to 44 degrees for noise normalized results, still easily the best temperature we've seen in noise normalized testing, and that's because the large 180mm fans allow the system to stay cool even at low and quiet speeds. The GPU temperature climbed to 56 degrees and the original Torrent was 55, so they're the same. They're within our variance here. And it's still outperformed by some of the other mesh-fronted cases on the chart. Still, it could be worse. The O11 Air Mini and the Meshify 2 Compact started with a disadvantage here, already outperformed to the baseline torture test, and that didn't change with noise normalization. The O11 Air Mini had an uncomfortably hot 61-degree GPU average, and that's above ambient, remember, and the Meshify 2 Compact was close behind at 59 over ambient on the GPU. Wrapping it up then, the biggest thing we didn't like was the cable management. There's like no space back here to work with the cables on the back side of the case. It is a pain in the ass. And talking with Keegan and Patrick on the team, Keegan doing all of the B-roll and footage work for this, so he's had to work with a lot. Patrick, who did the core review of this, we all agree that it's a potential deal breaker for people. There are ways to deal with it. The biggest unfortunate thing is, you you can definitely manage the cables in a way where it closes. We did it. But the thing that I don't like is even if you tighten the screw to get the panel to hold, if there's any bulge in that glass, tempered glass really doesn't do well with prolonged stress in ways for which it wasn't designed. And so that just leaves us a little uncomfortable. Not really much of a safety issue because it's tempered glass, but having it bow out, and we noticed it wasn't flush with the front of the case in most scenarios, closing it with all the cables in there. So you end up in a scenario where you potentially shatter the glass over time. Some of you have likely seen this. We've certainly had tweets about it where people have their glass on cases spontaneously shatter. This is very rare, but it's also not special to computers. It really, most of the time, has nothing to do with the components or the heat or anything. It's just a phenomenon of tempered glass, pretty well known at this point and documented in every industry. Anyway, adding unnecessary stress is just not something we like to do for glass. But also, it's still just a pain in the ass. So even if you ignore that, the human factor side of it isn't great. So that's the biggest downside. Whether this is a deal breaker or not, it depends how much you want the case. For the most part, if you're working with a simpler build, if you have a GPU, maybe like one CPU power cable, maybe two, and that's about it in terms of components that want direct power, you're gonna have a much easier time managing this. If you are doing a bunch of RGB LEDs, if you're using LED hubs, if you are adding fans, if you're gonna add a pump and a radiator, especially water cooling with LEDs, that makes the cable management nearly untenable. You could do it, but you're gonna have to commit like your whole Saturday to cable managing it to get it in a way that it looks good and it closes. A lot of this could have been avoided with a steel panel on the side, at least for, well, probably for all the models, really. There's no real benefit here to glass on this side. It's not gonna look good for most builds anyway. And then steel, at least, it just bulges at the point of inflection, and that's kind of the end of it. So not as big of a deal as this, where you can see it, and it also, I mean, it's glass. So glass sort of buckling out looks a lot more obvious than steel buckling out at the center rather than at the seam. Overall, though, we like the case. Thermally, it is excellent. It is an extremely strong thermal performer. It's among the top results on all of our charts, if not the top result in some of the charts. And so for that alone, this case does end up in our overall recommended sort of listing of cases. It's just that be aware of going into it. You probably want a modular power supply. You probably want to limit how much you're doing with RGB LEDs plus water cooling. One of them, not a big deal. Both will be a pain. But on the other hand, it's smaller. So there's that. $150 to $170 versus $190 for the original Torrent. The Compact is a decent chunk less expensive at $150. It is also closer to what the majority of consumers would need or want for their build, and the Compact does still fit ATX hardware, so that's cool to see. It performs similarly or better in many cases for an air-cooled system similar to ours. So the less expensive option, this one, is an easy choice for a lot of consumers. $190, $200 for the Torrent. We don't think that it's overly expensive, meaning we think the price is fair for what the product is, but $190, $200 is a lot of money for a case. And so a lot of people just won't be able to buy the Torrent, even for how good it is. And that's where this one starts to come in. There's obviously a lot of competition here. The ones we would recommend you consider, if you want to look at others, look these up. We have reviews for all or most of these. Corsair 4000D, Corsair 5000D, Fantex P400A, Fantex P500A, the digital variants of those, the ones that come with all the fans. You'd also want to look at some of Fractal's other cases, but very different in ID. So like the Fractal Meshify and the Compact series previously. And additionally, from Cooler Master, you have things like the TD500, also a good case to look at. So plenty of other ones too in our case reviews. But those would be the competitors to look at most closely. We do think this case is overall good. We think that it really needed a little bit more cable management space, but it's not the worst thing that we could damn a case for. So this is going to be, it's less clear of a victory than the Torrent, but it's definitely a, hey, evaluate your build. And if what we've said sounds like it matches your build for being a better use case for this, then go for it, because it's a good case, except for that one thing. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersaccess.net to help us out directly. We have the coasters up on back order. They'll be back in stock soon, and these things are awesome. We sold through them basically immediately when we launched them. So go grab them on the store if you want one. Patreon.com/GamersNexus for behind-the-scenes videos. We just published one, actually, a brand new one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.